Brussels, Prague, Madrid, Paris, and Warsaw. Beyond being major European cities, all of these places have been gripped with farmer protests this year. Farmers in Europe have been challenging soaring costs, increasing bureaucracy, and regulations stemming from the EU's Green Deal, a policy that looks to guide the European Union towards climate neutrality by 2050. In protest, these farmers have clogged city streets, they've had altercations with law enforcement, and even gone so far as to dump hay, rotting food, and animal waste in front of government buildings. Joining us now from Lisbon to help explain these protests is Bill Wirtz, Senior Policy Analyst at the Consumer Choice Center. Bill, thank you for being back with us on Forum Daily.
Thank you for having me.
So we've seen these protests throughout Europe. Are all of these protests more or less the same? Or do farmers in different countries have different grievances?
They do have different grievances. I mean, whether it's Poland and the import of grain from Ukraine, or whether it's France, where farmers are protesting retailer margins, or Germany, where it's about the cost of diesel or agricultural vehicles, where the government suggested for taxes to go up, they're not all the same in terms of the exact grievances and policies. However, there is a uniting factor. The uniting factor is that they don't feel listened to by national governments and the European Union, and also they feel that there is overbearing regulation that currently makes it difficult for them to make ends meet.
And when it comes to those grievances, you mentioned essentially two levels of government. How is that divided in terms of a Canadian audience hearing a European talk about the EU versus national governments? What is decided at the EU level versus what is decided nationally?
Oh, that's a very complicated question, but ultimately the EU sets targets and it says, okay, you need to reduce your carbon dioxide emissions, your nitrous oxide emissions, your methane emissions, and how you get there is sort of up to you. So different governments pursue different ways of getting to that end. Which is why the protests are different, but ultimately always come back to the question of how much of this should be on agriculture. And that's why you see that farmers don't just protest in their member states, but they also do protest in Brussels. And so the messaging is also really tailored. You really see that the farmers understand how those different levels of government work. And what you see is that they ask different things from different levels of government. But ultimately, it all comes down to the EU saying, we have a problem with climate action and farmers need to do their part. And farmers say, there's only so much we can do.
And what do you make of the farmers' claim that there's only so much they can do? Is that a valid criticism of the European approach in terms of merging agricultural policy and climate policy?
I think so. I mean, let me give you a practical example. In Germany, when the farmers were protesting against the rising fuel prices, Greenpeace came out and said, oh, what you should just do is buy an electric tractor instead. But they sort of left out that an electric tractor costs about double the amount of money, and Germany has amongst the highest electricity prices in Europe. So while there may be alternatives available, they're really not on the scale for farmers to shift to those alternatives. Also, the same goes for pesticides. The EU wants them to reduce pesticides, but they say we have no alternatives. It takes 10 to 12 years to approve new chemical products in the European Union. So while farmers would certainly like to do their part, it is currently not possible for them to do so. So they're being taxed and penalized for something that they have really no control over.
And have any of these protests led to concessions, either nationally or at the EU level?
Absolutely. Very impressive concessions, actually. So the German government has diluted its tax proposal. The Dutch government has delayed its cut in the fertilizer emissions action that they wanted to take. The French government has made concessions, and more importantly, even the EU has made concessions on pesticide reduction. It has even said that it wants to reduce the amount of national inspectors that will come and inspect your farm. A lot of these things are really showing to be impactful. Because we are in an election year after all, we will have European elections in June. And I think a lot of the farmers continue their protest also because they know that they are having political successes here.
Yeah, you mentioned the elections. What's been the response of citizens to these protests? Because obviously there can be a lot of disruption. Are they helping the farmers' cause? Are they hurting their cause?
Yeah, it's really fascinating because despite the amount of disruptions that many citizens are facing, what you see is that in Germany it was 80% of respondents said that they sympathize with the farmers. In France now, a new poll came out, 89% of people actually supporting the farmers, despite all of the disruptions and the fact that the French protests have been considerably also more violent, with retailers and fast food chains being broken into and vandalized. So I mean, it's really impressive, and that's why you see these immediate political actions, because you can protest as long as you want, but ultimately what politicians look at is the polling results, and there they can really see that if they don't act on this now, the elections are going to look very grim for them.
We'll be right back. We're going to have more with Bill Wirtz when we return. We're back with Bill Wirtz talking about the farmers' protests that have gripped major European cities. Bill, but before the break, you were mentioning the responses from citizens and that there's some level of support. But do you expect these protests to pick up and worsen? Or are we at a point where maybe the tension can be brought down a level and some negotiation or additional concessions can be made?
I think it's very likely that those protests will continue up until the European elections, because what we've seen is that initially many European governments have been trying to label these protests as, being politically in one camp or the other, and farmers really didn't appreciate that. And then they came out and did this politicking where they say, "Oh, we're gonna increase the tax, but it's gonna take a couple of years." So essentially, like blurring the line on what the policy is really going to be. And so farmers have been really upset and said, "We're going to continue protesting until we actually have palpable results." So I think they're going to continue. Will they worsen? I mean, it just really depends on the sort of the protest culture per country. And the protests just in Brussels this week were pretty violent, with police altercations as well. My message to farmers would ultimately be that this is not really helpful, because you already have the support of citizens. I don't think it's really necessary to set buildings on fire or police cars on fire. I don't think that that's going to be helpful to a democratic debate, though.
Bill, I want to shift gears here to another farmers' protest that's been kicking off in India. What do we know about what Indian farmers are protesting for, and how does that change, or how is that different than what we're seeing in Europe?
So the similarities, actually, because what Indian farmers complain about is the prices that they get from retailers and how much their produce is worth on the international market. And what is interesting is that what they ask for is essentially government intervention and setting floor prices and minimum regulatory prices. And this is similar to what we've also seen as a reaction by governments in Europe. And it's a bit reminiscent of the past, because what we've seen in Europe is when we had quotas and sort of the regulatory system engaging with what should be the price of potatoes and grain and so on, is that this actually had significant downsides as well. I mean, we got rid of milk quotas in Europe for very good reason, because it either caused under or overproduction. I mean, ultimately, when the government sets prices, this is sort of what happens. And it's very interesting that across the world right now, ever since COVID, those supply chain disruptions, those margins for farmers have been diminishing, and the reactions by many governments has been the same. And so India is actually no exception to the international rule, you could say.
And do you have any idea or any forecast in terms of where the Indian protests will go? Because we know that if we rewind a couple years, they were particularly successful in getting the government in New Delhi to change course on some major policies. Do you see it going that way again?
It's difficult to say right now, because it really all depends on the susceptibility of many farmers to get specific subsidies, and this is something we've seen across the world. Politics often is very successful in pinpointing the specific region to give a subsidy to then break off the protest. This actually also happened in France, where the government negotiated a deal where certain farmers' unions eventually said, "Oh, we're going to stop the protest because you gave us assurances that in times of emergencies we're going to get specific subsidies." So for the Modi government, it's also going to be about, who do I have to promise what in order to break up those protests and not suffer the political consequences. So this is a lot of strategizing on behalf of the government, but I think long-term solutions are not going to be brought about by a lot of these protests. I mean, because also agricultural policy takes time. We need long-term reviews and impact assessments on how things impact farmers. So very often governments just act in the short term, and there's nobody with clear vision for now. So that's something that really farmers should be striving for. Ultimately, maybe actually somebody who has experience in the farm sector to be agricultural minister for a change.
And I mean, we have about a minute left here, but why are we seeing these now? Ripped throughout Europe, we have India, we're seeing rumblings elsewhere. What is it in today's political climate globally that's driving farmers to these extremes?
A lot of people act surprised that we have these protests now, but I mean, people who have been following this for a while actually shouldn't be surprised whatsoever, because this has really been piling up. This is a sector that is completely overregulated by people who don't actually understand the sector whatsoever. We want agriculture to do everything. We want the cheapest food. We also want it to be super nutritional. It should not have no impact on the climate whatsoever and be the healthiest possible at all times. And also, please don't overfish and don't kill too many cows. I mean, it's just really detached from reality. You can only have so many things with the tools we currently allow farmers to use. And so this overregulation really eventually piles up. And you know, this has been similar with other protests as well. It's usually the last drop that really gets people to protest. And so this is where we're at right now.
Bill, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.